A cold evening breeze swept through the quiet park as Ethan, a street musician, tuned his worn-out guitar under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. The world bustled around him. People walked past, lost in their own hurried lives, barely noticing the young man with music in his soul. But amidst the indifferent crowd, there was one person who always stopped to listen. An old man, wrapped in a faded brown coat, sat quietly on the same park bench every evening. His face, marked by age and wisdom, carried a deep sadness. He never spoke much, only nodding in quiet appreciation after each song before walking away into the night. Ethan often wondered who he was, what stories lay hidden behind his tired eyes, and why he was always alone. Ethan had been playing on these streets for years, earning just enough to survive. He had dreams of performing on a grand stage, but life had not been kind to him. Rejected by music labels, struggling to pay rent, and barely affording meals, he played in the park simply because music was all he had left. One evening, as he strummed a melancholic tune, the old man did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket, took out a crumpled $20 bill, and placed it in Ethan's open guitar case. "You have a gift, son," the old man said, his voice deep yet gentle. "Don't let the world make you forget it." Ethan was taken aback. It wasn't the money that surprised him. It was the look in the old man's eyes. A look that spoke of understanding, of having once been where Ethan was now. But before Ethan could respond, the man walked away, disappearing into the evening mist. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. Who was that old man? Why did he always come alone? And why did his words feel so heavy, as if they carried a secret yet to be revealed? He had no idea that in just a few days, he would discover the truth, and it would change his life forever. Ethan had always believed that music had the power to connect people, but he never imagined it would lead him into the mystery of a lonely old man. The encounter from the previous night stayed with him, lingering in his mind like the final notes of a haunting melody. As he set up in the park again, he scanned the familiar surroundings, searching for the man in the brown coat. The usual crowd passed by, joggers, office workers, teenagers glued to their phones, but the old man was nowhere to be seen. A strange feeling settled in Ethan's chest. He had never spoken to the man before, yet his absence felt oddly significant. To distract himself, Ethan began playing a soft tune, the kind that usually drew passers-by into a moment of pause. But today, the music didn't feel the same. His fingers moved automatically, but his heart was elsewhere. Who was that man? Why did his words feel so personal? As the sun dipped lower, Ethan packed up his guitar and made his way home. A tiny apartment above a laundromat, filled with half-written lyrics and broken dreams. He had moved to this city 5 years ago, chasing a dream that seemed to move farther away with each passing day. His parents had disapproved of his choices, calling his passion for music nothing more than a childish fantasy. "You need a real job, Ethan," his father had always said. "Music won't put food on the table." But Ethan couldn't let go. Even when gigs dried up, when record labels ignored him, when every audition ended in rejection, he still played. Because playing music was the only time he felt truly alive. The next evening, he returned to the park, hoping to see the old man again. And just as the streetlights flickered to life, there he was, sitting on the same bench, gazing into the distance. Ethan finished his song and hesitated for a moment before walking over. "Hey," he said, gripping his guitar strap nervously. "You come here often, don't you?" The old man turned to him, his eyes filled with quiet amusement. "For years now," he replied. "Why?" Ethan asked before he could stop himself. The old man chuckled. "Because sometimes you need to listen to the world before it stops listening to you." Ethan frowned, unsure what that meant. "You told me last time not to forget my gift. Have you played before?" For a moment, the old man said nothing. Then he smiled, a small, almost wistful smile. A long time ago, there was something in his voice, a weight to those words, that made Ethan curious. But before he could ask more, the old man stood up. "Play something for me, son," he said. "Something from the heart." Ethan nodded, strumming a melody he had written years ago but never performed. As he played, the old man closed his eyes, as if remembering something long forgotten. And when Ethan finished, he saw something unexpected, tears glistening in the old man's eyes. Without a word, the old man patted Ethan's shoulder and walked away. Ethan watched him go, a strange feeling in his chest. This was more than just an old man who liked music. There was a story here, one that Ethan was determined to uncover. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was something special about the old man. His words, his reaction to the music, it was as if he carried a past filled with untold stories. That night, Ethan lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene in his mind. Who was he? Why had his eyes filled with tears? The next evening, Ethan arrived at the park earlier than usual, determined to learn more. He set up his guitar, watching the bench where the old man usually sat. But hours passed, and he didn't show. A quiet sense of disappointment settled in Ethan's chest. Maybe he wouldn't return. Maybe he was just another passerby in the endless cycle of strangers. Just as Ethan was about to leave, a soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "You play beautifully, young man." Ethan turned around and found the old man standing there, wearing the same brown coat, his hands tucked into his pockets. A smile tugged at Ethan's lips. "I wasn't sure if you'd come back." The old man chuckled. "I suppose I'm a creature of habit." He gestured toward the bench. "May I?" "Of course," Ethan said, watching as the old man slowly took his seat. For a moment, they sat in silence. Then Ethan gathered his courage and spoke. "You said you used to play. What did you mean?" The old man exhaled, staring into the distance. "Music was my whole life once," he admitted. "A long time ago, I stood where you are now, playing for anyone who would listen." Ethan's heart pounded. "What happened?" The old man hesitated, as if debating whether to answer. Finally, he said, "Life happened. Success, failure, regrets. One day, I put the guitar down and never picked it up again." Ethan frowned. "But why?" The old man gave him a sad smile. "Because sometimes, when you lose yourself in the pursuit of something, you forget why you loved it in the first place." The words struck Ethan in a way he hadn't expected. He thought about his own struggles, the times he had doubted himself, the nights he had questioned if he was good enough. "I don't believe you should have stopped playing," Ethan said. "Music, it's a part of you." The old man looked at him, something unreadable in his expression. "Maybe you're right," he murmured. A silence fell between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two musicians who understood each other without words. Finally, the old man stood up. "Thank you for the music," he said. "It brought back memories I thought were long buried." Ethan watched as he walked away, feeling like he had only scratched the surface of a much deeper story. A mysterious clue. The next day, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. He decided to do some research. He didn't know the old man's name, but something about him seemed familiar. He spent the afternoon at a local library, searching through old newspaper archives. He typed keywords into the database: famous street musicians, forgotten artists, retired performers. Nothing seemed to match, until he stumbled upon an article from nearly 3 decades ago. The headline read, "The Vanishing of Samuel Reed, a musical legend's sudden disappearance." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He clicked on the article and scanned the words frantically. Once hailed as one of the greatest guitarists of his time, Samuel Reed's sudden exit from the music industry remains one of the biggest mysteries. At the height of his career, he walked away from fame and fortune, never to be seen on stage again. His whereabouts remain unknown. Ethan's hands trembled as he stared at the old black-and-white photo of a younger Samuel Reed. The sharp jawline, the deep-set eyes, the familiar look of someone who had lived through music, it was him. The old man who had been listening to Ethan play was Samuel Reed, a legend, a man who had disappeared from the music world decades ago. Ethan's heart raced. Why had he left? Why was he living as an anonymous old man in a quiet city park? There was only one way to find out. He had to talk to him again. The next day, Ethan couldn't contain his excitement or his nerves. He arrived at the park early, scanning the area for any sign of the old man. Hours passed, and he began to wonder if Samuel Reed would return at all. Just as doubt crept in, he spotted the familiar brown coat approaching from a distance. Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself. This wasn't just any street performance anymore. This was a meeting with a living legend. As Samuel settled onto his usual bench, Ethan picked up his guitar and began playing a melody, not one of his usual songs, but a tune he had discovered the night before while researching. It was an old, nearly forgotten piece, written by none other than Samuel Reed himself. The moment the first few notes drifted through the air, Samuel's posture stiffened. His eyes, once distant and observant, widened in shock. His hands, resting on his lap, clenched into fists. When the final note faded, there was silence. The park, the city, the world itself seemed to pause. "Where did you learn that?" Samuel's voice was hoarse, almost fragile. Ethan hesitated before answering. "I read about you," he admitted. "I know who you are." Samuel's expression darkened. He looked away, his jaw tightening. "That name, Samuel Reed. It belongs to someone I used to be. But it's still you," Ethan insisted. "You wrote that song. It's a part of you." Samuel exhaled slowly. "Why did you look me up?" "Because I needed to know why a musician like you, someone so talented, would walk away from everything." A bitter chuckle escaped Samuel's lips. "You think talent is enough?" He shook his head. "Music is more than just playing notes. It's sacrifice. It's pain. And sometimes, it takes more from you than you ever intended to give." Ethan sat beside him, waiting. He could sense there was more, something Samuel had been holding on to for years. After a long pause, Samuel finally spoke. "I had everything," he began, his voice low and distant. "The fame, the money, the adoration. People called me a genius. But the more successful I became, the less I recognized myself." He rubbed his hands together, as if trying to warm them. "I was obsessed with being the best. I toured endlessly, pushing myself past my limits. And in the process, I lost the most important person in my life." Ethan swallowed hard. "Who?" Samuel's eyes glistened. "My wife, Margaret." The weight of those words hung between them. "She was my anchor," Samuel continued. "The one person who believed in me when I had nothing. But I was too blinded by ambition to see that I was leaving her behind. One night, after a heated argument, she told me that if I kept chasing the stage, I would lose her forever." Ethan listened in stunned silence. Samuel looked up at the sky. "I told myself I'd make it up to her after one last tour. But life doesn't wait for one last tour. She got sick while I was on the road. By the time I came home, she was gone." A lump formed in Ethan's throat. Samuel's voice broke. "The music that once brought me joy became a reminder of what I had lost. So I walked away. From the career, from the stage, from everything. I thought if I stopped playing, the pain would fade. But it never did." Ethan's mind raced. He had always believed that music was a gift, something that could never be abandoned. But Samuel had lived a different truth, one where music had cost him everything. "Do you regret it?" Ethan asked softly. Samuel sighed. "Every day? But some things can't be undone." Ethan thought about his own life, the struggles, the sacrifices. He had often feared that his passion for music would never amount to anything. But sitting here, listening to Samuel, he realized something. The real tragedy wasn't failure. It was giving up on what you loved because of fear, pain, or regret. "You don't have to stop playing," Ethan said gently. "Music didn't take her away from you. It was the choices you made. But you can still make new ones." Samuel studied him for a long moment. Then, for the first time, a flicker of something, perhaps hope, crossed his face. Ethan reached for his guitar and held it out. "Play with me," he urged. "Just one song." Samuel hesitated, his fingers twitching. It had been decades since he had last touched an instrument. Could he do it? Did he even deserve to? Ethan strummed a few chords, creating a familiar rhythm. Slowly, tentatively, Samuel's hand extended toward the guitar. His fingers brushed against the strings, trembling slightly. Then, as if something deep inside him had finally awoken, Samuel played. The sound was raw, imperfect, hesitant at first, but within seconds, it transformed into something beautiful. The years of absence melted away, and for the first time in decades, Samuel Reed, the musician, returned. A small crowd gathered, drawn by the unexpected duet. They had no idea they were witnessing the rebirth of a legend. As the song ended, Samuel let out a shaky breath. His eyes glistened with unshed tears, but this time, there was no sorrow in them, only release. Ethan grinned. "You still got it." Samuel chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Maybe I do." At that moment, something shifted. The past still lingered, but for the first time, it no longer defined him. Samuel Reed wasn't lost. He had just been waiting for the right melody to bring him back. The applause that followed their duet was soft at first, then grew louder as more people stopped to listen. Some clapped out of appreciation, others out of curiosity, completely unaware that they had just witnessed the return of a legend. Samuel looked around, his fingers still resting on the guitar. His breathing was uneven, his heart racing. He hadn't played in years, yet the music had come back to him like an old friend. Ethan beamed. "See? It's still in you." Samuel exhaled slowly. "I don't know what just happened," he admitted, shaking his head. "It's been so long." "Maybe too long," Ethan said. "But that doesn't mean it's over. You just played in front of a crowd, and they loved it." Samuel looked at the small audience, his gaze uncertain. The old fears crept in. What if he couldn't keep up? What if he wasn't good enough anymore? But then, he saw something in their eyes. Admiration. They didn't care about perfection. They had simply enjoyed the music. One woman stepped forward. "That was beautiful," she said. "Do you two play together often?" Ethan grinned. "We just met." The woman's brows lifted in surprise. "Well, you sound like you've been playing together for years. You should definitely perform more often." Samuel hesitated, but Ethan jumped at the opportunity. "That's actually a great idea," he said. Then, turning to Samuel, he added, "You should come play at my gig tomorrow night." Samuel's head snapped up. "What?" Ethan shrugged. "I have a regular spot at a small cafe nearby. It's nothing fancy, but people come for the music. You should play with me." Samuel opened his mouth to protest, but Ethan cut him off. "No excuses. You just played here, in a public park, after years of avoiding music. What's one more night?" Samuel let out a slow breath. The idea terrified him. But beneath the fear was something else, something he hadn't felt in years. Excitement. "I don't know, kid. One song," Ethan insisted. "That's all I'm asking." Samuel looked down at the guitar, then back at Ethan. One song. Could he do it? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Samuel nodded. "All right. One song." Ethan's face lit up. "You won't regret it." The next evening, Ethan arrived at the cafe early, checking the sound equipment and adjusting his set list. His heart pounded as he glanced toward the entrance. Would Samuel show up? As the clock ticked closer to showtime, doubt crept in. Maybe he had asked for too much. Maybe Samuel had changed his mind. But then, just as he was about to give up hope, the door swung open. Samuel stepped inside, looking around uncertainly. He was wearing the same brown coat, but there was something different about him, like a man who had just rediscovered a part of himself he thought was lost. Ethan rushed over. "You came." Samuel nodded. "I said I would, didn't I?" Ethan grinned. "Come on, let's get you set up." The cafe was intimate, with warm lighting and a cozy atmosphere. A small crowd had already gathered, sipping their drinks and chatting softly. Ethan started the set with a few of his usual songs. The audience swayed along, enjoying the music, but he knew the real moment would come later. As his last solo song ended, he took a deep breath. "All right, everyone," he said into the microphone. "I have a special guest tonight. Someone who has more talent in his pinky finger than I have in my whole body." The crowd chuckled. He's a bit of a legend, though he probably won't admit it. But tonight, he's stepping back into the spotlight, even if just for one song. Please welcome Samuel. A murmur spread through the audience as Samuel hesitantly made his way to the stage. He picked up the guitar, his fingers tracing the strings as if reacquainting himself with an old love. His hands shook slightly, but when Ethan gave him an encouraging nod, he took a deep breath and played the first chord. The melody was rich, deep, and full of emotion. The room fell silent, mesmerized by the haunting beauty of Samuel's music. And then he sang. His voice was older now, rougher than in his prime, but it carried a depth of feeling that no amount of youth could replace. By the time he finished, the cafe was utterly still. Then, as if a spell had been broken, the crowd erupted into applause. Samuel sat there, stunned. The cheers, the smiles, it was overwhelming. But this time, it didn't feel like pressure. It felt like home. Ethan clapped him on the back. "Told you they'd love you." Samuel chuckled, shaking his head. "It's been a long time since I felt this alive." The cafe owner approached, his eyes gleaming with interest. "That was incredible. Would you consider playing here again?" Samuel hesitated. A week ago, he would have laughed at the idea. But now, he looked at Ethan, then back at the owner. "Maybe," he said, a small smile forming. "Maybe I would." The applause still rang in Samuel's ears as he set the guitar down. He had expected to feel exhausted, overwhelmed by the rush of emotions that came with performing after so many years. But instead, he felt something different, something lighter, relief. For the first time in a long while, the weight of his past didn't feel so heavy. He looked up at the crowd, still clapping, their faces beaming with admiration. Among them was Ethan, grinning like he had just won a bet. "You killed it, old man," Ethan teased, nudging him. Samuel let out a breathless laugh. "I can't believe I just did that." "You didn't just do it. You owned it," Ethan said. "Did you see their faces?" Samuel did. He saw wonder, respect, and most importantly, joy. These people weren't analyzing his skill or comparing him to his younger self. They were simply moved by the music. And for the first time in years, so was he. The cafe owner, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a warm smile, approached them. "Samuel, that was something special. We haven't had a performance like that in a long time." Samuel rubbed the back of his neck. "I appreciate that. I wasn't joking when I said you should come back," the owner continued. "How about playing here every week? Nothing formal. Just you, your guitar, and an audience that would love to hear more." Samuel hesitated. A week ago, he would have turned it down without a second thought. But now, after tonight, after feeling the warmth of music fill his soul again, he looked at Ethan, who gave him an encouraging nod. Samuel exhaled slowly and smiled. "All right, I'll do it." The owner clapped him on the shoulder. "Fantastic. I'll get the details sorted, but take your time. Just know you're always welcome here." Samuel nodded, his heart swelling with something he hadn't felt in years, purpose. Later that night, as they walked through the quiet city streets, Ethan turned to Samuel with a knowing smirk. "So, how does it feel?" Samuel thought for a moment. "Terrifying," he admitted, then chuckled. "But also amazing." Ethan grinned. "Told you." They reached the park bench where Samuel had spent countless nights. The cold wind rustled through the trees, but for the first time, it didn't feel quite as lonely. Ethan sat down beside him. "You know, you don't have to stay here anymore." Samuel glanced at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you're back on your feet now," Ethan said. "People want to hear you play. You have a gig. Hell, you have a place where you belong again." Samuel let the words sink in. For years, he had convinced himself that this was his life now, drifting through the streets, playing for himself, waiting for time to fade away. But now, where would I go? He asked. Ethan shrugged. There's always a way. You don't have to figure it all out tonight. But maybe, just maybe, this isn't the end for you. Maybe it's just the beginning. Samuel looked up at the stars. He had spent so many nights staring at that same sky, wondering where he had gone wrong. But tonight, for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the past. He was thinking about the future, and it didn't seem so hopeless anymore. Over the next few weeks, Samuel became a regular at the cafe. Word spread fast, and soon, people were showing up just to hear him play. Some recognized his name, others had never heard of him before, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the music, and Samuel played with everything he had. The more he played, the more he found himself again. His fingers, once stiff with years of neglect, moved more freely. His voice, once filled with uncertainty, grew stronger. One night, after another successful performance, he found Ethan waiting for him outside. You know, Ethan said, crossing his arms, there's this recording studio I know. Pretty small, but they help independent artists get their music out there. I think you should check it out. Samuel raised an eyebrow. You trying to turn me into a star again? Ethan laughed. Nah. Just trying to remind you that you never stopped being one. Samuel chuckled, shaking his head. But deep down, something stirred. A year ago, he had believed his life was over. Now, standing here, with music in his heart and hope in his veins, maybe it was just beginning.